Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Seidman, the Puffin Foundation Curator for Social Activism at the Museum of the City of New York. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, welcome to the latest installation of Curators from the Couch. I'm here on my couch and excited about our discussion today. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll be talking about activist women, past and present, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, providing voting rights to women, although not all women, and which went into effect on August 26, 1920. So we're about to hit that 100-year mark, and we've been sort of celebrating this past week. And this clearly has a complicated legacy, as we'll discuss. Our two wonderful guests are scholars Allison Lange and Mary Phillips. So for those of you first who don't know, Activism New York is an ongoing exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York. It's on view in the Puffin Foundation Gallery, and it's been up for several years with rotating content, and examines the ways in which ordinary New Yorkers have agitated and mobilized together, and sometimes clashed, and exercised their power to shape the city and nation's future. And the exhibition features historic artifacts and images from the museum's celebrated collection, as well as pieces on loan from other institutions, organizations, and individuals, and interactive elements that enable visitors to explore and express their views. So centuries of activist efforts across political ideologies are illuminated through a series of installations from the 17th century through today. And when the show first opened, we had a section on the women's suffrage movement of the early 20th century. And you can still see those artifacts on our website version of the show, activistnewyork.mcny.org. But in addition to having now a dedicated section on the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s, we have content that foregrounds women activists in reproductive rights struggles beginning in like the mid-19th century, the garment industry of the early 20th century, trans women activists in the 70s, and women in the movement for Black Lives Today, which is the final section of the show. And just going through slides, looking at the installation shots, just how many images and sections of the show get at women's histories. I was, feeling excited to be reaffirmed and reminded of that. So beyond Activism New York, I curated the Beyond Suffrage exhibition here at the museum that opened and was on view 2017 to 2018 for the New York State centennial. And we've also had the show Rebel Women up subsequently. So clearly this subject of women's histories is important to us at the museum, and I can't wait to dive in. Let's get started. First, I'm happy to introduce Professor Mary Phillips. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Lehman College, City University of New York. Welcome, Mary. Mary's expertise include the modern Black freedom struggle, Black feminism, and Black power studies. She was selected as a 2018-19 award recipient for the American Association of University Women American Postdoc Research Leave Fellowship, and she's currently working on her book manuscript, Sister Love, Erica Huggins, Spiritual Activism, and the Black Panther Party, under contract with New York University Press, and I can't wait for that book. She's published journal articles in Souls, the Women's Studies Quarterly, Western Journal of Black Studies, Spectrum, and the Syllabus Journal. Two of her essays have been nominated for the Association of Black Women Historians, Letitia Woods Brown Best Article Prize, and her essays have also been featured in Huffington Post, Ms. Magazine, New Black Man in Exile, Color Lines, Vibe Magazine, Black Youth Project, and Black Perspectives blog. And you also helped found the Intersectional Black Panther Party History Project. So
yes,
thank you
for having me.
And also with us is Professor Allison Lange, an expert on the history of women's suffrage, professor, curator, public speaker, and writer. You all wear a lot of hats. She's an associate professor of history at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. Her book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement, was published in May 2020 by the University of Chicago Press. Institutions that have supported this work include the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Library of Congress, and American Antiquarian Society. And Lange also engages in public history as well. She's worked with the National Women's History Museum and curated exhibitions for the Boston Public Library's Leventhal Map Center. In preparation for the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment, she's curating exhibitions at the Massachusetts Historical Society and Harvard's Schlesinger Library, which we could also, hear more about. So thank you both so much for being here. Just going to dive in to the first question. Allison, congratulations on the recent publication of your book. I know it traces the ways that women's rights reformers and their opponents used images to define gender and power in the US in the fight over the 19th Amendment. Could you talk us through a few of the more iconic images? And I'd also love to hear your take on just the complexity of this anniversary, which commemorates the right to vote for most women, but of course it was not, a full victory and is a complicated history. And maybe how the images, help us understand the complexity of this history. Who could vote, but who could not vote, especially at this moment with the 2020 election coming up. So a lot for us to dive into.
There is a lot for us to dive in today, and I'm so excited to be talking to both of you. And I'm going to start us off with probably an image that you're not expecting. Probably some of us are familiar with suffrage pictures, but I'm actually going to show you, this one is called Bloomerism in Practice, which you're welcome to Google. It's available online through the Boston Public Library, so you can zoom in and see all the details here. But Bloomerism in Practice actually gives us a sense of the popular images that represented women's suffrage into the 19th century, well into the 20th century. And I would argue some of these themes actually still influence the way that people mock women in power. And you can see there's the suffrage leader in the center. She's smoking, she's wearing bloomers, which is scandalous at the time. She's showing ankle, abandoning her child, sitting in the, standing in the front crying while her husband is leaning over knitting, or mending clothes, doing menial housework. And so there's this idea that if women win power, if women win the vote, that men will have to do more feminine tasks and that they will abandon their traditional roles as female caregivers. In the background, we get a sense of the ways that this gender shift might influence not only might influence a shift in racial hierarchy, right? So we see a Black woman kind of protesting against slavery in the background. So protesting the economy of slavery, but also white supremacy. And then also another woman in the background who I think is intended to be like a servant. So thinking about the ways that class might also shift if women win this power. So opponents, and this is just one image, but this is one of many thousands that people encountered in the 19th century. And some of the people to kind of counter that, that kind of propaganda was Sojourner Truth was really one of the earliest women to do that. She followed in the footsteps of Frederick Douglass, who's actually the most photographed American of the 19th century. And Sojourner Truth recognized that her photograph could actually really challenge racist and sexist stereotypes. And so she started distributing her photograph in the 1860s. These are really small, they're carte de visites, kind of like baseball cards is what I always tell my students. They're really cheap. And you kind of wanted to collect them all the ones of your favorite kind of figures of the day. And so she really recognized that this was a powerful tool to emphasize that she was a dignified Black woman. And a lot of activists actually realized the power of distributing these photographic portraits, right? So in contrast to these artist cartoons, which an artist could kind of make up these stereotypes as they wished, photographs really conveyed a sense of of truth, of authenticity. And so Susan B. Anthony is probably most famous for taking on the kind of strategies, embracing the strategies that Douglas and Truth had before her. And she was really the one to make sure that white women suffragists had their portraits taken and distributed widely. And she really made sure that she did that. She distributed photographs through newspapers, through the History of Women's Suffrage, this really major 6-volume series. And she was really emphasizing that women could be in powerful leadership positions. She's one reason why we have a lot of these portraits of these important figures today. But she also selected who those portraits would be of. So there's real emphasis on white women in power. And we can see that from a lot of the suffrage propaganda, like this one. One of the many pieces that really emphasize that white women need the right to vote because they will, take care of the stereotypically motherly ideal. They'll be able to take care of their children. I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of really wonderful, colorful, engaging propaganda that's from these early generation of female artists like Rose O'Neill, who created this one, but it had a very particular message with it. And the next image I have is actually one of the only images, and Julius, if you wouldn't mind, yeah, perfect, is one of the only images, actually the only image I found in my years of research in the archives that really emphasizes that Black women need the vote because they're mothers. Otherwise, we have the National Association of Colored Women didn't really have the kind of funding to kind of create the visual propaganda that we're more familiar with today. And so this is actually produced by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it was printed in The Crisis, which was their publication, but also as a separate poster. And it shows a Black woman with her children in her skirts with a bat labeled Federal Constitution, and she's beating down Jim Crow laws and segregation and grandfather clauses. And so really emphasizing that Black women need the vote in order to take down these major discriminatory of the day. And so this gives you a quick sense of the kind of images that were part of these conversations about women's voting rights. And this last image really gives us a sense of, as Sarah, you mentioned, what's the legacy for today, right? Often we see this idea that the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, which we know is absolutely not true. It's the amendment actually prohibited discrimination based on sex. So states rather, still used other laws that prevented other people from voting, right? So particularly people of color, Native American women couldn't even become citizens until 1924. Asian American women, Chinese and Japanese women had other different citizenship dates. Later on, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a major turning point. So I think one of the really important takeaways as we think through this centennial is that the 19th Amendment is a really important milestone, but it is not the end of the voting rights story. And I think that Mary is going to talk to us a little bit more about how women's activism really continues long after the 19th Amendment.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Allison. That covered a lot of ground. And I've been thinking about that too with, press. We've been doing, like how these histories also just aren't linear, steps forward, steps back. And Mary, I'm about to turn over you. So sorry to interject, because I know you're working on a manuscript about Erica Huggins, activist, Black woman, and how she was such a compelling force. And curious how you feel women activists in the 60s and 70s and Black women activists in particular, have both related to the suffrage movement, but then also set the stage for what's happening now.
Yeah, so when we think about activists today and the work that they did in relation to the suffrage movement and the work that they did to Black radicalism, which is in particular what I look at, Black women activists today are studying Black women of the 60s and 70s. They're using their movement work as blueprints. When we think about Black women, they are the leaders of the movement. we are leading the Democratic Party. When we have Kamala Harris, as a vice presidential candidate, that ties directly to the work of Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress, really setting the stage for Kamala Harris, particularly when we think about her 1972 bid for presidency. And all of this, when we think about, so my book in particular is really a biography of Black Panther Party veteran Erica Huggins. And what makes her story compelling is really due to the fact that her story engages so much of restorative healing, spiritual practices, and this is something that we don't always talk about in relationship, or I should say hasn't really been written about extensively in a literature. When we think of, like I mentioned, Shirley Chisholm, or, we think about many other, Dorothy Height, many other Black women activists, we don't always hear about how did they sustain themselves through using healing practices, restorative practices as they going up against the state, as they advocating for suffrage, right? All of these kinds of things. How did they manage this, right? Really doing that kind of inner work. And that is really the heart of my book. For those who don't know much about Erica Huggins, she was a high-ranking yet understudied figure in the Black Panther Party, one of the longest serving women in the organization. She's so broad in her talents and in her skills. She was an educator, she was a poet, she was a human rights activist, former political prisoner. In the late 60s, she was incarcerated for a crime she didn't commit due to the FBI's counterintelligence program. And so my book, in particular, looks at her day-to-day experience and acts of political dissent through an examination of the self-affirming spiritual practices that she began while she was in prison. And that included meditation, that included letter writing, that included, the composition of poetry and prose, really building women in prison, doing things that were much more larger than, herself, right? That include movement arts such as yoga, right? And then bringing all of that restorative work once she got out of prison to the work of the Black Panther Party. And also that work influencing, groups such as Black Lives Matter, and the current work today. I think when I look at organizations such as Black Lives Matter, they are very much centering these kind of restorative practices because they're, like I mentioned, they're studying folks before them. So.
Wow, that's so interesting about the kind of restorative and like self-care, right, in the movement. Because I've been working on, thank you for that. I've been working on updating the final section of Activist New York on the movement for Black lives, and women are so key to telling, that story from the three founders of Black Lives Matter kind of hashtag to women at every level of organizing today. But I feel like there are more materials in there. We have a healing manual from the Black Youth Project 100 on display, and just like how activists can function, continue to function amidst such challenges at every level, and divisions and marginalization within movements, as well as forces beyond the movements. So that's really interesting. I think my final question, like for both of you, what do you think? I guess what do you think the role of women in the movement is today beyond crucial, and what do you see, I guess, as what's next, like tentpole hurdle, but also, and this goes to what we were talking about before we went live, like how do we do how do we tell the histories of this moment? How do we tell these recent histories, current history? How do we anticipate the future histories that we'll be writing? So just another very tiny question for both of you.
Tiny question that we could probably all talk about for quite some time. If you don't mind, if I'm going to do a little history connection, and then Mary, if you want to follow up with that. So Julius, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the Inez Milholland on a horse photograph. So in 1913, Washington, D.C. hosted kind of like the first major suffrage parade. And there's this really famous photograph of Inez Milholland, one of the first women to graduate with a law degree, riding a horse as a herald in this parade. And this was kind of distributed all over. She was very famous at the time. She was considered like the prettiest suffragist, certainly a leading face of the movement. And I think it's really interesting that one of the photographs that stuck out to me in June is this other photograph, the next one, of Breonna Noble, who actually rode a horse into Oakland for a Black Lives Matter protest. And I think that it's really a compelling connection between the past and the present. Why these women on horses kind of leading the way, forging the path forward. And I think that that's a really exciting connection between this historical movement for women's rights and the current one. And I think another example of that is, of course, the fact that suffragists were the first group ever to picket the White House. And, in the last couple of months, we just had a major White House protest with the Black Lives Matter, painted literally on the street in front of it. And so I think it's really interesting to see the ways that past activists have really laid the foundations for our present moment.
Mm-hmm. And, we have a lot of activists that are still here with us, and so, my work does so much with oral history. I'm writing about a living historical figure. And so, as they're with us, able to really talk to them, write down their stories. I think it's unique to hear from them because you get to ask them things that has not been documented, and really trying to fill those holes and push the scholarship forward. And so I think it's a treat to have, these historical figures with us, to be able to kind of do this work. And for me, it's been, a relationship that's been cultivated for years, and trust, negotiation, the kind of exchange that's been happening, and just full honesty, that has really, kind of grown with me in the subject of my book manuscript. But I think it takes time. I think trust is key, because you're writing about somebody's life, and making those connections with the past.
Thank you for doing that important work, and to really, because we all know that the stories, the materials that are in archives don't necessarily, represent a fraction of what happened. And that's why we know about Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton more than others, because they literally wrote, the book and put themselves at front and center. So who is writing these narratives, and how, as, scholars and historians, we can, and in museum exhibitions, of course, we can shed light on stories and women's histories, in this case, that have not always been heard, or that have been obscured. So thank you both for doing this work. I think we have, time for a few questions from the audience.
Yeah, one question is about the 19th Amendment, as you mentioned, was really just the beginning. But what about some of the organizing tactics from that time, or activists at that time, still resonates today, or kind of originated then?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a ton of protest tactics that the suffragists really designed, and that we still use today. One example is, of course, this visual campaign that I pointed out here, right? So they realized that, most images that people were encountering were representing women as, unable to kind of be these political figures. And so people had to really change the way that people thought about gender in order to secure this kind of power, right? So that's one of the reasons why Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, that's why they're distributing these portraits, because they want to change this conversation, change the ways people are thinking about race and gender and class, et cetera. And so even though that's something that, ultimately becomes a national campaign, right? So initially it's these individuals doing that. But by the turn of the century, it's, suffrage organizations actually have press committees. They're hiring publicity professionals. They are bringing in their own artists to create this work. They recognize the centrality of kind of just changing the way people are even just thinking about gender. And so that's a great example of the ways that suffragists kind of strategized, came up with new ideas, but also their protest tactics. Really beginning in the late 19th and early 20th century, they borrowed them from labor activists, from British suffragists. They started marching in the streets, giving speeches on the sidewalks. I already mentioned this big national parade in Washington, D.C., as well as those pickets of the White House. I mean, if you've been to the White House, during your lifetime, you've probably seen some sort of protest. You kind of just usually someone protesting the White House. But the suffragists were really the first group ever to do this. And so they really made that a site for political protest that it is today. And I think that's one that I think will stick with us for sure too.
Yeah, and I think the same could be said when you think of an organization, I look at Black freedom struggle, in particular women in the Black Panther Party. I mean, the Black Panther Party was very, very conscious of visual culture and how they used visual culture to really counter the kind of imagery that was being perpetuated them, in popular culture, which was portraying them in a way that was very derogatory. So they was using the camera, they was using the press, they was using their newspaper in ways that really, push back against that kind of violence. So
I think that's really important because it's also connecting to an even earlier movement that used this kind of imagery to change people's minds, which is the anti-slavery movement in the United States. Even in the 18th century, they were creating imagery that wasn't always as kind of anti-racist as we'd like for it to be today, but but they were creating campaign material to counter the practice of slavery, which is fascinating to see the kind of long line of ways that activists have used images to change it. And I think it's interesting today because a lot of activist leaders are coming up with new ideas, new strategies, new ways that people in leadership positions should look just to kind of connect with our changing world.
Certainly seeing, so many images and graphics, digital graphics that get at, what folks are mobilizing around today. So absolutely. Do we have time for one more question? Or?
Yeah, it was sort of a follow-up on that last discussion. Someone brought up the Young Lords and also how that ties into some of these movements that you guys are talking about.
Yeah, so when you think of an organization such as the Young Lord, they were about autonomy. They were about, really serving their community in practical ways. They modeled a lot of their work off of the Black Panther Party's 10-point program and platform. And so they were also in the streets serving their communities, really doing free breakfast program. When we think about women, particularly in the Young Lords, they were advocating for their own autonomy, for their own voices. They were fighting against machismo, and really, you have women that really elevated, on the Central Committee. And so you see some similarities in the activist work when you look at both of those kinds of organizations, but they're building on, women activists, before them as well. So studying movements globally, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we have a great photograph in the Young Lords section of Activist New York of Denise Oliver, who's on the Central Committee, and another member of the Young Lords speaking right at International Women's Day. So, of course, the connections are always there. Well, I think even though we could keep talking forever, you all packed a lot of amazing and really enlightening information into this session. So thank you so much. That brings us kind of to the end of this installation of Curators from the Couch, Great. I want to thank both Professors Allison Lange and Mary Phillips for a great conversation. Thank you to the Puffin Foundation for its continued support of the Activist New York exhibition. And thank you to my colleagues at the museum for all of the work that went into this program. And we have several free virtual programs coming up, so mark your calendars. Our outdoor installation, New York Responds, is now open on 5th Avenue and 103rd Street outside on our terrace. So if you are nearby and want to stop by, please do. And also keep sharing the images of what you're seeing and experiencing in New York during this historic moment by tagging photos on social media with our hashtag ActivistNY or COVID Stories NYC. On August 26th, the certification anniversary, we will have our next Moonlight in Movies screening virtually and discussion on the film The Dominican Dream, featuring a conversation with basketball phenom Felipe Lopez and film director Jonathan Hawk. And then on September 1st, Days, a prolific artist, one of the most acclaimed graffiti writers of his time, will be on hand for a family-friendly event sharing stories about his time as a young artist growing up in New York City. As always, you can head to mcny.org to learn more about any of our exhibitions, collections, or to find out about other live stream or other events. And come visit us when we reopen our doors with a host of precautions designed to keep people safe. That is happening August 27th. So please do stay in touch and come see us physically or virtually. And thank you again, Mary and Allison, for joining. Thank you so much, and see you next time.